The Young and the Restless Spoilers Shock. In Genoa City, where loyalty was a commodity and bloodlines were both weapons and wounds, the quiet between betrayals never lasted long. Cane Ashby and Claire Grace had always shared something that went beyond mere resemblance. They mirrored each other's darkness in ways that made everyone around them uneasy. Both had grown up in the shadows of stronger families, always standing on the periphery of power, watching others seize what they believed was rightfully theirs. It wasn't cruelty that defined them, it was calculation, the slow, deliberate art of revenge masked as self-preservation. To them, harming others wasn't personal, it was the only language the world had ever taught them to speak. But what made this alliance terrifying was not their ambition, it was the calmness with which they pursued it, the lack of remorse that wrapped every decision in quiet justification. And so when whispers began circulating that Cane and Claire had been meeting in secret, even those accustomed to the dysfunction of Genoa City felt a chill of foreboding, because every story involving them seemed to end the same way, with someone broken and someone else victorious, though neither truly won anything worth keeping. Victoria Newman had sensed something off about her daughter for weeks, but denial had become her comfort. She had convinced herself that Claire's sudden reclusiveness was a phase, perhaps the residue of too many emotional wounds left by the Jordan ordeal. But intuition was cruel, it always whispered before proof arrived. That evening, when Victoria's car followed Claire's down the quiet suburban roads outside of Chancellor Park, she didn't know whether she was acting as a mother or a CEO trying to manage a crisis before it exploded. The sky was bruised with twilight as she watched her daughter park outside a discreet house on the corner of Willow Street. At first, it seemed harmless. Just another of Claire's secretive visits to someone she didn't want the family to know about, but when Victoria recognized Cane Ashby stepping out of the doorway, everything inside her went cold. The name itself was enough to tighten her chest. Cane had been circling the Newman empire with dangerous precision, and if he had somehow drawn Claire into his orbit, the consequences could be catastrophic. Victoria's instincts told her to leave, to retreat before her emotions clouded her judgment, but love made her reckless. She parked a few houses down and slipped quietly toward the property, her heels sinking into the soft ground as she moved through the dim light. The windows were cracked open, the faint glow of lamps casting long shadows across the curtains. Inside, Cane and Claire were speaking in low tones, their voices too faint to make out. Victoria leaned closer, careful not to make a sound, straining to catch a single word that might explain why her daughter was meeting with one of the most manipulative men in Genoa City. But every word that escaped the room came muffled, swallowed by the hum of air conditioning and the occasional clink of glass. She inched closer until her ear hovered near the edge of the window frame, her breath shallow, her heart thudding like a drum she couldn't silence. The risk was enormous. If they caught her, the damage would go beyond embarrassment, it would confirm every fear Claire had ever accused her of, that Victoria didn't trust her, that she saw her as a liability rather than a daughter. Yet the pull of maternal dread was stronger than caution. For a fleeting moment, Victoria thought she heard Cane mention something about the algorithm, and her stomach turned. The AI project had already been a source of friction across every corporate line in the city, and now her daughter was standing in the middle of it. The idea of Claire working with Cane on anything made her blood run cold. It meant manipulation, secrets, and eventually, destruction. But then, just as she was preparing to retreat, one word pierced the murmur of conversation and froze her in place, sister. Victoria blinked, certain she'd misheard, but then Cane's voice repeated it, clearer this time, my little sister. The shock was immediate, visceral. It didn't make sense, there was no universe in which Cane Ashby and Claire Grace shared blood. Her mind scrambled through possibilities, a metaphor, a manipulative nickname, a code for something else. But the tone in his voice wasn't one of flattery or control, it carried genuine affection, the kind that couldn't be faked. Victoria's breath hitched as she leaned closer, the need for clarity outweighing every rational fear. Inside, Cane had placed a file on the table, its edges frayed, the cover unmarked. Claire was flipping through the pages with an intensity that made her look older, harder, as though every line she read carved away a piece of innocence. Victoria couldn't see the contents, but she could see the tremor in Claire's hands. Whatever was in that file wasn't business, it was personal. And then she heard Cane again, his voice thick with something that sounded like guilt. He said he hadn't known until recently, that he had found out through an old hospital record, something buried deep within a sealed adoption file from decades ago. The words landed like shards of glass. Hospital record. Adoption. Victoria's mind raced to connect the dots, to make sense of the impossible. Was it true? Could there be a hidden link between her daughter and this man who had spent half his life weaving in and out of scandals? The thought was so absurd it almost broke her composure, but deep down, she knew Genoa City had never respected logic. It thrived on secrets buried so deep they eventually rotted their way to the surface. Claire's reaction was quieter but far more unsettling. She didn't seem surprised. If anything, there was a strange calmness in her eyes, the kind that comes when truth only confirms what one already suspected. Victoria could barely breathe as she watched her daughter rest her hand on Cane's shoulder, a gesture that looked too intimate to be casual. The scene was wrong, all of it, the dim light, the unspoken tension, the revelation twisting through Victoria's mind like smoke. And then, without warning, Claire whispered something that made Cane laugh softly, a sound that sent a chill down Victoria's spine. They were planning something. She couldn't hear the details, but their body language told her everything. This wasn't just a reunion, it was a partnership. Whether by blood or by vengeance, they had found in each other the perfect reflection of their own resentment. As Victoria backed away from the window, the full weight of what she had witnessed settled over her like a shroud. If Cane truly was connected to Claire by blood, that meant years of lies, lies that stretched across families, timelines, and betrayals. And if it wasn't true, if the claim was part of another one of Cane's manipulative schemes, then her daughter was once again being used by someone who saw her as a pawn in a much larger game. Either way, the damage was already done. She had seen too much, and yet not enough. The ambiguity was worse than certainty because it left her imagination free to conjure horrors. Was this Cane's revenge on the Newman dynasty, disguised as a familial revelation? Was he using the emotional void inside Claire to drive a wedge between mother and daughter? Or had fate, in its cruel symmetry, actually bound them together by blood, ensuring that no matter how hard Victoria fought to protect her family, corruption would always seep through the cracks? Back at the ranch later that night, Victoria couldn't sleep. The memory of Cane's voice, "My little sister," echoed like a curse. She went through every possible scenario, pulling old files, cross-referencing birth records, and digging into archives she wasn't supposed to access. The more she searched, the more inconsistencies appeared. Claire's original birth certificate had been sealed under unusual circumstances. Certain hospital logs from the same year had missing entries. And one name kept resurfacing, a midwife who had also assisted at the birth of Cane Ashby in Australia decades ago before disappearing from public records. The connections were thin, circumstantial, and yet too deliberate to ignore. Could someone have engineered this? Was Claire's adoption manipulated by the same forces that once orchestrated countless corporate cover-ups in Genoa City? Meanwhile, Cane and Claire's alliance deepened. They met often, each encounter pushing them closer to something that felt less like family and more like a covenant. Cane saw in Claire the kind of cunning he had always admired but never mastered. She possessed an emotional detachment that made her dangerous in ways he could never be. Claire, in turn, saw in Cane the validation she'd craved since learning the truth about her own past, a man who didn't judge her for her darkness but shared it. Together they began to construct a plan that blurred the lines between justice and revenge. Cane's AI network became their weapon, and Claire's access to Newman confidentials became their leverage. What began as a conspiracy rooted in mutual resentment evolved into something more intimate and unholy, a shared belief that they were the rightful heirs to a world that had always treated them as expendable. As the days passed, Victoria's torment grew. She couldn't confront Claire without proof, but she also couldn't watch her daughter sink deeper into Cane's influence. The fear that they were siblings was only half the nightmare, the other half was realizing that, blood or not, they were becoming indistinguishable in spirit. Both had inherited the city's sickness, the compulsion to destroy in order to feel powerful. And Victoria, for all her authority and intellect, found herself powerless against the slow corruption spreading through her family yet again. Genoa City had always thrived on secrets, but this one, if revealed, would be the kind that rewrote legacies, shattered identities, and left everyone questioning where loyalty ended and blood began. By the end of the week, Victoria was no longer the composed executive she pretended to be. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Cane's smirk, Claire's cold expression, the eerie tenderness of that word, sister. She didn't know which truth frightened her more, that they were lying, or that they weren't. Either way, the revelation had become a fuse, and in Genoa City, fuses never burned quietly, they exploded. Victoria Newman pressed her hand against her mouth, stifling the sharp intake of breath that threatened to escape her. The moment her daughter, Claire, had spoken those words, my brother, the ground beneath Victoria seemed to shift. Her knees felt weak, her pulse quickened, and for a moment, she thought she might collapse. But she couldn't. She had to understand, she had to hear more. It wasn't possible, it couldn't be true. Cane Ashby was not Claire's brother. He couldn't be. The thought alone was so outrageous that it felt like a knife twisting in her gut. But the undeniable truth of the situation slowly started to sink in, creeping over her like a cold fog. She hadn't misheard, she'd heard it clearly, and it wasn't a slip of the tongue or some misguided attempt at a joke. Cane had referred to Claire as his sister, and Claire hadn't corrected him. She hadn't even flinched. It was as though the words were a part of a truth that neither of them had the courage to voice until now. Victoria's mind raced, trying to piece together the jigsaw puzzle of the moment. She had always known that Claire kept secrets, too many secrets. But to discover this impossible truth, something so fundamental, shook Victoria to her core. Why hadn't she seen it before? The way Cane and Claire had gravitated toward each other, their shared coldness, their mutual disdain for the things they could never have. But this? This was a line she couldn't cross. They weren't just partners in crime or co-conspirators. No, they had history, a history she wasn't prepared to fathom. As she crouched there in the darkened corner of the room, hidden behind the thick drapes, Victoria felt as though the air had been sucked from her lungs. She had to know more. But at what cost? If Claire caught her eavesdropping, the damage would be irreparable. Her daughter would never forgive her for spying, for doubting her. But how could she just walk away from this? How could she ignore the overwhelming flood of confusion and terror that now engulfed her? Victoria's heart pounded in her chest as she leaned in closer to the window, her breath shallow and ragged. She couldn't stop herself. She had to know what was happening. Cane's voice drifted through the crack in the window, softer now, as he spoke again to Claire. Victoria strained to listen, her pulse hammering in her ears as every word sent a chill down her spine. "Don't worry, sis," Cane murmured, his tone strangely tender, like someone trying to calm a child. "Everything's set up. We'll make it happen. They won't even know what hit them." "Sis?" The word echoed in Victoria's mind. It felt wrong, like a lie she couldn't fully grasp but couldn't ignore either. The thought of her daughter, her only daughter, having such an intimate, familial relationship with Cane, a man who had never been anything but a threat to her family, made her stomach churn. What kind of twisted bond was this? Suddenly, Claire's voice broke through, her response soft but determined. "You promise, Cane?" "I promise," Cane replied, the sincerity in his voice disturbing. "You're my sister. I'll protect you. I'll do whatever it takes." Victoria froze, her body trembling with a mix of fear and anger. This was too much, too impossible. Claire had never mentioned Cane like this before. The thought of their connection, whether by blood or some twisted emotional manipulation, was enough to make Victoria want to scream. What had been hidden from her all these years? How could Claire, her own flesh and blood, hide something so significant, so monumental? Was her daughter so entangled in Cane's web of lies and deceit that she had completely abandoned her family for a man who represented everything they had fought against? Victoria's mind whirled with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Could Cane be telling the truth? Could Claire actually be his sister? The pieces didn't fit. Victoria had always thought that Claire's adoption had been handled transparently, with no room for deception. But this revelation called into question everything she thought she knew. What if the story of Claire's adoption was a lie? What if there was more to her past than anyone had ever dared to uncover? The seconds felt like hours as Victoria continued to listen, her body pressed against the windowpane, trying to remain as still as possible. She had to know what came next. But her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Claire rising from her chair. It was too late. Claire was leaving. Victoria's heart skipped a beat as she realized the danger she was in. If Claire caught her, all of her suspicions, all of her fears, would be confirmed. Claire would know she had been eavesdropping. Victoria quickly turned, her instincts kicking in, and she stumbled backward, careful not to make a sound. Her heart raced as she scrambled to get back to her car, praying that Claire wouldn't notice her. She couldn't face her daughter now, not with the weight of this new information pressing down on her. Not with the terror that something about Claire's past, something deeply hidden, was about to shatter the world she had worked so hard to protect. Victoria's hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel, her thoughts a tangled mess of dread and confusion. What was she supposed to do with this information? What was the right course of action? Should she confront Claire, demand the truth? Or should she keep quiet, bury the knowledge, and hope that time would somehow erase this unease, this impossible truth? She was too tired. Too exhausted from the constant battles with her family, her company, and her own fears. This was something she never anticipated. The idea that Claire and Cane might share a connection that went beyond manipulation was more than Victoria could bear. If Cane was indeed her son, that meant everything had been a lie. All the efforts Victoria had made to build trust, to protect her family from the wreckage of the past, had been for nothing. The walls she had built around herself, around her daughter, would crumble. And Genoa City would become nothing more than a battlefield of truths too painful to face. But what if Cane wasn't telling the truth? What if this was all part of his plan to control Claire, to twist her into his own image? What if he was using her as a pawn in his scheme to take over the Newman Empire? It wouldn't be the first time Cane had manipulated someone close to him to further his own ambitions. The thought of Claire being so completely under his thumb filled Victoria with both rage and sorrow. But more than anything, it made her feel helpless. She didn't know who to trust anymore. She didn't know who her daughter was, or if Claire even knew herself. Victoria pulled the car into her driveway, still dazed by the revelation. The weight of the truth, whatever it was, pressed down on her with a force that left her breathless. She couldn't just ignore it. She couldn't pretend that nothing had changed. Claire had been hiding something from her. Something important, something that threatened everything Victoria had worked for. And now, the walls around her family were more fragile than ever. She had to act, but how? How could she protect Claire from herself, from Cane, from the web of deceit that was tightening around them both? In the days that followed, Victoria couldn't shake the images of Cane and Claire together. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw their faces, intertwined in ways she couldn't understand. Were they really siblings, or was this just another of Cane's schemes to destroy the Newman family from within? And if they were connected by blood, who else was involved? What if there was more to this story than she could ever have imagined? Cane's ambition had always been clear. But now, with Claire at his side, whether by blood or manipulation, he had become a far more dangerous foe than Victoria had ever anticipated. The city was already on the brink of war, and Victoria realized that no matter what she did next, she would have to choose between family loyalty and protecting the empire that had come to define her. The question that remained, as Victoria stared out into the quiet of the night, was simple: how far would she go to uncover the truth, and what would she do once she had it?